set of Pikemen's Armour, not because of the design, but because of the decoration. That would not be normal for an ordinary soldier. If you were a member of the Honourable Artillery Company in London, where being a soldier was a hobby, you trained in that and you were quite wealthy, this is the sort of thing you wore. But the basic shape is that of a fully equipped armoured pikeman. In Tudor times there would have been armed defences, but they'd all gone by this stage. So basically what you've got is the backplate, breastplate, and these things are called tassets or taces. And they allow you to bend. And of course they protect the middle regions, all the important bits and pieces were in there. It was a standing joke in Europe that the English soldiers had the biggest tassets in Europe. Our ancestors were always very worried about that area there. But they are very difficult to wear because armour follows fashion. Do you remember I said where the fashion height was for the waist? So it is on armour. It's quite high. So they don't actually flex where you want them to. And if you do any sort of heavy duty in these things, invariably the bottom catches in your breeches. You cannot run in these. Of course, people didn't run unless they were running away. A charge in those days was a much more slower thing than a bayonet charge of later years. But these things gave you a certain amount of protection. They would stop a pistol ball. It wouldn't stop a musket ball at reasonable range, that would pass through it. But a pistol ball it would deflect, and the pistols was one of the main weapons of the cavalry. And pikemen, by this stage, that was their main job, protecting the other foot soldiers from cavalry, because the pike, if I had one here, if I was stood here, the butt of the pike would be here, and the tip would be up there on that wooden strut running along there. They're about 16 feet long. Sometimes they were 18 feet, and the Spanish pikes were 15. Which is not clever if you're up against someone who's got a 16-foot long pike, because you go in like that. And that's called coming to push a pike. So you actually, if you were advancing with these, you tuck the pike under your chin like that, and your arm rests on the butt end, and you move forward gradually like this, shoulder to shoulder. English, at least the parliamentary army, followed the Dutch pattern. Usually you were 6 deep. So you imagine hundreds of steel tips coming towards your face. And it was, and of course the enemy would have the same sort of thing. So it was a matter of playing chicken who was going to break first. But if they did come to what was actually called push a pike, they could be locked there, just thrusting at one another like that. Quite a horrendous affair. And people actually described debris laying on top of the locked pikes, where people would come up and chuck things, and it's just locked there. Dead men still stuck in the ranks because they were so tightly packed they couldn't fall to the ground. It didn't happen very often in the Civil War. The main purpose for this was to form a bristling stockade, basically, to keep cavalry at bay, while the musketeers took shelter behind them. And of course, if the cavalry rode up, and the pistols the cavalry use are pretty ineffective. The drill manuals at the time actually say, come up and touch your opponent on the helmet before you fire the pistol. Because if you're bouncing about on horseback, you can't aim, and they're not that powerful. So at that distance, you might just be able to penetrate the armour. At the Battle of Runway Down, this happened. Richard Atkins, who was a royalist captain, he kept a journal. He describes coming up against the parliamentary colonel Hazelrig, who was in full armour. His regiment was the only regiment in the Civil War which was fully head to foot covered in armour. And he actually chased him and rode up behind him and touched him on the helmet and fired. And a bit of the helmet came off, and he says, which much amazed him. But he still kept riding, it didn't penetrate. So these give you some protection, but it is incredibly uncomfortable to march. It slows armies down having to wear armour. And again, to the textbook, and they went over it lots of times, cavalry were supposed to do 12 miles a day, and infantry 8. And that's mainly because of this, but in fact they did much greater distances than that. But it is very wearing, and of course, when you've got it on, when it's hot, it is incredibly hot. And when it's cold, it's freezing, and when it rains, it goes into what's called an English pot. Notice the way it sweeps away. This again is against enemy cavalry. Because if a cavalryman comes up with his sword, he sweeps down, that deflects the blow off your head and clear of your shoulders. So the pikemen, important, it's the more glamorous part of the infantry, at least they always thought they were, but it's the musketeers that do most of the actual real work on And the musketeer would wear exactly the same clothes, but no armour. Certainly as the war went on, there might have been one or two helmets at the beginning of the war, but the musketeer just wore the soft clothes.